So far we have seen that the astral plane has the function, or the stay on the astral plane has a purificatory action. People, after they die, their consciousness is positioned on the astral plane, and what happens there depends on many conditions. We saw a spiritual person would go swiftly through the astral plane, mostly unconscious or in a dreamy state with pleasant dreams, and then wake up in the heavenly realm. An average person may stay longer on the astral plane because before one can enter this heavenly realm, consciousness has to let go of those elements that are not compatible with the heavenly realm. As we are going to see in the next series, this is a state of complete bliss and happiness, joy. Therefore, no discordant elements can be there in consciousness. And desires, for example, by definition are discordant, are sources of suffering, because if we cannot satisfy that desire, then the state of not satisfaction is a kind of suffering. Also, we can satisfy the desire, but at some point we get bored with that, or so that is also a state of suffering. So in this astral realm, we have to get rid of anything that can produce suffering in any way. In a sense, it's like a meditation. If when we try to go deep into meditation, we quiet the physical body, then we need to quiet the emotions, and we need to quiet the mind. And only when all those levels are quiet, we can enter this deeper state of awareness in meditation that is peaceful, etc. If there are any elements that are discordant, then we are stuck there. We cannot move past them until those elements are resolved, are let go of. So this astral experience has that function: purify consciousness so that it can experience the heavenly state. In people in whom these discordant elements were strong, or they were very identified with them, or these elements were very important, obviously those people will need a longer process, a longer period on the astral plane for these elements to dissolve, let's say. As we mentioned, it's like having a desire that is unhealthy, let's say. If the desire is strong, we can get rid of it by not satisfying it, but the time that we will need until we don't desire that thing any longer will be a longer time than if the desire is not so strong. So similarly, the same thing happens with consciousness on the astral plane. Some people who are very attached, we saw, may still long to some kind of communication with the physical plane. In general, when consciousness is on the astral plane, the natural tendency for consciousness is to go back to our spiritual nature. The spiritual nature is there exerting an attraction, so to say, on consciousness. So consciousness normally doesn't look back into the personal life that has just ended. But in people whose spiritual consciousness is not strong enough, or the personal consciousness was very strong, they may look back to communicating with the physical plane, and that is never good for the soul and delays the process, etc. And then we had some other people who were attached to the personal nature, but not in connection to things that need to be experienced in a bodily state. I mean, if a person is too attached to drinking, for example, and that only can happen if you have a physical body. So that kind of people could be attracted to earth, to places where there is drinking going on, and they can feel more or less those emotions, as we saw. But in people who are not particularly spiritual, but they have intellectual interests or artistic interests or things that have to do more with non-physical actions per se. Obviously, art may involve some kind of physical expression, but the conception of art and the enjoyment of art is in general more abstract. If these people are not spiritual, because you can have a very intellectual or artistic person or things like this and also be very spiritual, and they will go swiftly through the astral plane. But if they are not, they may awaken on the higher plane or aspect of the higher plane, the higher subplanes, and they have the possibility of continuing to do what they were doing on Earth in a far freer, more creative way, because the matter on the astral plane is less solid and rigid than the physical. There are far more possibilities on the astral plane. And sometimes these people stay there for a long time. And actually staying on the astral plane is far less satisfactory than just moving on to the heavenly experience. But people who are not spiritual, they may be afraid of what sometimes is called the second death, the death to the astral plane and the rebirth on the heavenly plane. So these people may stay for a long time on the astral plane until at some point the spiritual awareness asserts its influence on them. So this is a summary that we saw of the normal cases. Today we are going to finish with some exceptions to the rule, which are people whose life have been cut short. For example, by sudden deaths or by means of suicide or accidents or being killed, etc. These are special cases, and we will see why. So Annie Besant says, another class of disembodied entities in Kamaloka, on the astral plane, includes those whose lives on Earth have been prematurely cut short by their own act, the act of others, or by accident. Their fate depends on the conditions which surrounded their outgoings from earthly life, and their measure of responsibility in their premature death, which may vary within very wide limits. The condition of such has been thus described. So Besant in her book quotes lengthy fragments, mainly from the Mahatma letters that Blavatsky's teachers wrote to the early members of the Theosophical Society. In this presentation, I have restructured this so that we can go more systematically. And Besant writes again about this in an appendix at the end of the book. And I have integrated what she says in the appendix and in this particular chapter. So we have here a kind of compilation of what Besant says in this book. So the condition has been described as follows. The rule is that a person who dies a natural death will remain a few hours to several short years within the Earth's attraction, that is, the Kamaloka. So this is what we have seen so far, a few hours in very spiritual people, and a few years, depending on how spiritual or attached to the world the person was, Although, as we have seen, that those few years may be extended for long years if the person so chooses. But the master continues, but exceptions are the cases of suicides and those who die a violent death in general. Hence, one of such egos, and this is a technical term for the souls in Theosophy, who was destined to live, say, 80 or 90 years, but who either killed himself or was killed by some accident, let us suppose at the age of 20, would have to pass in Kamaloka not a few years, but in this case, 60 or 70 years. So this is why here there is an exception. We come, according to Theosophical teachings, we come into birth with a certain amount of vitality, let's say, which will make the physical body and the astral body and the mental body last for an X amount of time. Now, if the body is killed before that vitality was exhausted, all that happens is that consciousness is still there within an astral body that is alive, but without a physical body. Remember that we saw that after death, the astral body arranges itself in layers. And this is the body of the astral body of a dead person. The difference between a dead person and an alive person, a living person on the astral plane, is the structure of the astral body. A living astral body has all the matter in the different kinds of astral matter intermingled, and the astral body of a dead person has all these layers. So when a person is killed before the time for natural death comes, the astral body does not arrange itself in these layers because it is still alive, let's say. So the person finds himself or herself alive on the astral plane without a physical body. And that person will have to stay on the astral plane for as long as the vitality that astral body has remains. So as the master says there, if the person would die when he or she was 80 or 90 and was killed being 20, then there will be 60 or 70 years on the astral plane alive, not in a state of dreaming, not in a state of introverted consciousness, not in a state of, swiftly aspiring to heaven, but as alive as before, except without a physical body. Now, as we are going to see, all this varies. The person can, in fact, be in a state of dreaming, and we are going to see. But the principle is that the person will find himself or herself alive on the astral plane. And as Annie Besant says, depending on the conditions, then there can be different possibilities. So Besant continues, in the cases of victims of accident or violence, they have to wait on within the region of desires until their wave of life runs on to and reaches its appointed shore. They wait on, wrapped in dreams soothing and blissful, or the reverse, in dreams that are more nightmarish, according to the mental and moral state at and prior to the fatal hour, but nearly exempt from further material temptations, and broadly speaking, incapable, except just at the moment of real death, of communicating with mankind. So people who die not because of their own responsibility, either an accident or they were killed, they do tend to fall into a state of dreaming. Now, that dreaming, if it is a person that was a good person that normally had an awareness that was not taken over by strong desires and passions and ill intentions, etc., that person will tend to sleep there with pleasant dreams. If the death was very violent and traumatic, sometimes the person may be there repeating in his or her consciousness the scenes, the situation of the death for a while, until that person falls into this more peaceful dreaming. This is not different from when we go to sleep, or no, not even that. When something happens during our day that really produces an impact in our consciousness, we all know how that keeps coming into our minds, and our minds keep thinking about it and repeating that thought. And then we have to struggle to try to get rid of that thought, and the thought tends to come back because that produces an impression in consciousness, and the energy tends to flow through that channel that was produced there and reproduce the same pictures or images. And then if we go to sleep, we tend to have dreams about that. So this is similar to that situation. If the death was very traumatic, then the person may stay for a while on the astral plane repeating that scene until, as it happens with us, after a while, that just time, kinds of heals that impression, and then the person may go back to sleep naturally. Now, in cases of accidents, even if the accident is quite bad, death normally happens fast, and that's not too much of a problem for the consciousness of the person. When I say traumatic, is mostly the circumstances around the death. Now, in people who were people prone to violent emotions, etc., it is far more common that these people will be asleep, but with more of a nightmarish kind of consciousness. And again, that happens to us during the day, in a day where our emotions have been really upset, etc. We may have nightmares about that. So a lifetime of those kinds of emotions may produce in these people, if they are killed prematurely, may produce that they are alive on the astral plane and repeating these negative, dreams. But this happens more with people, we all have different kinds of situations in which our emotions may be, awakened and be afraid or angry or with anxiety, etc. That kind of, if it is within the normal life, that would not produce this. We are talking about people who were more on the side of, evil people, or people who didn't care about others and did damage to others. So this is one of the cases. Now, Annie Besant says, in the case of conscious sane suicides, this is different. And there is a distinction that you will see. One situation is when a person kills himself or herself because of mental illness. And a different situation is a person that commits suicide to escape from the results of his or her actions, to escape from some situation, not because of a mental illness, not because of depression. It's the same decision. I don't want to face this, and the person kills himself. So the first case we are going to see is this one. So the case of conscious sane suicides is different. The unhappy being revolting against the trials of life, resulting of its own former actions, trials which are heaven's merciful medicine for the mentally and spiritually diseased. So a person is facing trials that are the karmic result of previous actions, but as Annie Besant says there, these difficult results are actually how karma heals and the soul or the mind that has wrong tendencies. If that person determines, instead of manfully taking arms against the sea of troubles, to let the curtain drop, and as it fancies to end them, if that person kills himself to end his troubles, then the following happens. In the case of the suicide, death is brought on voluntarily as opposed to an accident or being killed, and with a full deliberate knowledge of its immediate consequences. Sane suicides are separated from their higher principles by a gulf. The sixth and seventh principle remain passive and negative to the day when they would have died a natural death. So the sixth and seventh principle, remember we saw in the first class, are two more spiritual principles in us. We call them in Theosophical literature with the Sanskrit words Atman and Buddhi. Atman is the higher self, Buddhi is the source of wisdom and love. So in the case of people who decide to kill themselves, the higher principles, there is like a separation between the higher principles and the mind and the emotions that are left now in Kamaloka, on the astral plane. And these principles are passive in the sense that normally after death, as I mentioned, the higher principles are actively attracting the consciousness of the person. There is this natural, just like when we fall asleep, there is like an attraction, let's say, to falling asleep, and we want to fall asleep. We feel the attraction to falling asleep. When we cannot fall asleep, it's like that attraction is not there, and then we cannot fall asleep. So similarly, in normal deaths, the higher consciousness is attracting our personal consciousness. But in the case of sane suicides, that doesn't happen. There is like a momentary separation, which will last for as long as that person would have stayed alive, if not for killing himself or herself. So Annie Besant says, the suicide destroys the body, but finds itself precisely as much alive mentally as before. It had an appointed life term determined by an intricate web of prior causes, which its own willful sudden act cannot shorten. That term must run out its appointed sands. So we have seen this. This is the same case with people who die of accidents. So now this person, the difference is that because the higher consciousness is not attracting the personal one, as we are going to see, suicides stay awake on the astral plane in general, these same suicides. So they find themselves exactly as before, but without a physical body. So Besant says, the poor, unhappy, and misguided mortal who kills himself, seeking to elude fate, finds himself terribly alive and awake, instinct with all the evil cravings and desires that embittered his world life, without a body in which to gratify these. And see here, as we are going to see, what determines the kind of state that we are going to find ourselves in, in all these different possibilities. It's not so much the act, the killing oneself or being killed or being in an accident, etc. What is most important is the motivation, the state of mind that produces the act. Because we are looking here at a person that is so attached to having his or her way, to his ambitions, his desires, then when life takes them away, they just cannot bear it, and then they decide to kill themselves. And what Annie Besant says here, then they find themselves awake on the astral plane with the same desires, with the same sense of, I don't want life to take this away from me. But now, of course, he himself took away any possibility of that. Or we have people who committed a crime and they don't want to go to jail, and in that state of fear and anxiety, they decide to kill themselves. Well, all that state will be with them as they wake up. Now, if a person kills himself for a different reason, there are some cultures where it is said that it is even honorable in certain situations to kill themselves. Killing oneself is never right, but if the motivation is produced by even a misguided, idea of honor, the results would be different too, because that person is dying mentally. The mental state is a state of, doing the honorable thing. So necessarily that mental state will produce a different, when that consciousness is on the astral plane, that consciousness will not be in the grip of all these negative emotions. It will be with the sense of doing the honorable thing. Now, karma will take care, the karmic results in the future will take care of teaching consciousness. Killing the body is never a good idea, but that person wouldn't apply to what we are looking at right now. And of course, people who kill themselves in temporary insanity, also the rules that we are reading would not apply to them right now, what we are reading right now. So again, quoting from one of the letters from the masters, woe to those attracted to mediums, because as we said, these people are alive with all their attachment, all their desires, all their regrets. And these kind of suicides are normally attracted to try to see how to get in touch with the earth again. For this reason, falling asleep on the astral plane is a protection for most people. The fact of falling asleep and being in this dreamy state is a protection, because otherwise they would seek coming back to earth if they are attached to earth, if they, as we explained, have no strong spiritual or religious aspirations. So nature produces a protection by making people fall asleep. We saw that if those people are awakened, by means of calling them in a seance or in a channeling, or by strong emotions and attachment from people left behind, that is not good for them, because then they are tempted to come back to earth. Now, in the case of suicides, they are already awake and they are already in the grip of attachments and emotions. So it's more common that they will seek some kind of communication with earth. And the master says, woe of those that seek this kind of communication and those who open the door for them. For in satisfying their thirst for life, the suicide's thirst for life, the medium helps to develop in them a new body with far worse tendencies and passions than the one they lost. So I mentioned a little bit about this. In these cases, there is a stimulation on the souls that are attracted of more materiality, more attachment. So when reincarnation happens, all the negative aspects of their personality was increased during all this period that the soul, instead of moving on, remains trying to satisfy not the soul, let's say the consciousness, the personal consciousness, instead of moving on, tries to remain attached to earth, satisfying all this. So the emotional body and even the physical body that will be inherited will be, worse than otherwise it would be if that person would just move on. And the mediums also, they begin to absorb all these tendencies from, these kind of entities, and they also degrade their own bodies. Now, Annie Besant says, let it not be supposed that there is no hope for this kind of people, for the same deliberate suicide. There is always a possibility of just bearing steadfastly his cross, suffer patiently his punishment, the punishment being on the astral plane with all these emotions, all these desires, being awake, unable to satisfy them, to gratify them. So what is the best case scenario? That the person just says, okay, I just have to put up with this and accept it. And there are on the astral plane, there is help trying to explain people, don't do this, this is the situation, you should do that. So there is always a possibility that a person accepts it. And just as when during life, we, the example that I keep bringing, we decide, I'm not going to gratify this, and we suffer the abstinence of that until it fades. Well, this person has to do the same. Say, I will refrain from trying to satisfy these cravings and suffer the abstinence of that. On the astral plane, as I explained, the emotions and desires and passions are felt more keenly, more strongly. So it's better to do it while we are in the body. And in the case of suicides, if they got to the extreme of killing themselves for that, obviously all these emotions will be strong. So there will be, a suffering to be endured. But as Annie Besant says, if the person decides to suffer patiently his punishment, punishment in quotation marks, the natural result of the situation, striving against carnal appetites still alive in him, in proportion to the degree to which it had been indulged in earth life. If that happens, he must never allow himself to be tempted here or there into unlawful gratifications of unholy desires by more or less vicarious gratification. If he never allows himself to be tempted, to enjoy again these things, as I explained in the previous class, by trying to absorb these emotions from people alive, then when his fated death hour strikes, after the period comes when the natural death would have happened, then his four higher principles reunite, Atma and Buddhi, the two higher principles that I mentioned, and then the mind and the emotions. These are the four principles that are left, which in a suicide, as we saw, there is a gulf, there is a separation between them. But if the person refrains from engaging into feeding all this, then when the natural time of death comes, the four reunite, and then they are in the same situation than a person that died normally. So Besant says the four higher principles reunite, and in the final separation that then ensues, when in the natural separation that we will see a little of that in this class, when the higher consciousness takes the best of the lower consciousness and goes into the heavenly state, in that separation, it may well be that all may be well with him and that he passes on to the subsequent developments in the heavenly state. So again, this is never a good idea, killing oneself. The person will have to face the suffering resulting from this, but still, if that person decides to do the right thing after killing the body, Then after he or she goes through this period, then he is coming back into the normal track and can move on with the normal experience. Now, the other case of suicides, Annie Besant says, not all suicides are fellow de se. This is a word that was used in the 19th century. It's like a felon of himself. It means somebody that committed a deliberate self-destruction. As we saw, a sane suicide is voluntarily and consciously committing a murder of himself. But this is not the case of all suicides. And she quotes again from the Masters, motive is everything, and a man is punished, karmically speaking, in a case of direct responsibility, never otherwise. A man who causes his death in a fit of temporary insanity is not a fellow de se, nor is he left a prey to the temptations of Kamaloka, but falls asleep like any other victim. So in the case of these people, they just fall asleep again, like people who die of an accident, for example. Again, what kind of dreamy consciousness they have there, many times is not a very pleasant dreamy consciousness. For a while, like anything, it's just like a person that is alive may be depressed for a few months or a couple of years, and eventually that person will come out of it. So similarly with this, again, killing himself or oneself is never a good idea. But in the case when this happens out of mental illness, of course, again, the mental illness is the result of past actions. So it's not that there is no responsibility, karmically speaking, in the person. But nevertheless, the result, the decision to kill himself was not taken consciously. It's just the result of the mental illness. So there will be a sleeping on the astral plane that protects that person from falling into the temptation to come back to earth and all that. But still, depending on the conditions, sometimes there are very spiritual people who kill themselves, just out of disappointment with the world, again, within some mental illness I'm talking about. And maybe in those people, the sleep is not even, very conflictive. Probably those people are still asleep with some kind of better dreams. But in general, for a while, one can suppose that there will be more of a negative state of mind and emotions until all that is healed, and then the person can go back to a more harmonious state of consciousness. Here again, there is help. The master says the Dhyan Chohans, which is a technical term in Theosophical literature for celestial beings. So there are celestial beings who have no hand in the guidance of the living human ego. There are some celestial beings who don't intervene or have nothing to do with living people, but who do protect the helpless victim when it is violently thrust out of its element into a new one, out of the physical plane into the astral plane, before it is matured and made fit and ready for it. So in the cases of sudden deaths, there are celestial beings they are trying to help. And always, as much as as much help as possible is given to people. Then how much people can be helped is, again, depends on karma. This is Similarly, in our daily life, sometimes people are in trouble, we try to help and we can't, or sometimes we try to help and we are able to. So similarly after death, but there is always the attempt to help and soothe and guide. And Annie Besant says, we must remember that thoughts and motives are material and at times marvelously potent forces. So thoughts and motives are potent forces, and we may then begin to comprehend why the hero, for example, sacrificing his life on pure altruistic grounds, sinks as his lifeblood ebbs away into a sweet dream, only to wake into active or objective consciousness when reborn in the region of happiness, in the heavenly state. So there are cases in which a person may offer his or her life in sacrifice, either in a robbery or in a war or an activist or things like that. And when the motivation is an altruistic one, then that person, as Annie Besant says there, falls into pleasant dreams and doesn't awake at all during the Kamaloka stage, and then they awake in the heavenly region. Now, in the case, this is not very pleasant to discuss, but in order to have a more or less, complete view of what are the different possibilities, I think it's important to have a certain idea. And there is a very practical consequence from this knowledge that I think is very important for all of us to keep in mind. So what happens when there is a sudden death, whether an accident, whether the person is killed or the person kills himself, in what we can call evil people, murderers or, people like this. So Besant says, when the victim of sudden death is depraved and gross, his fate is a sad one. And again, a quote, unhappy shades, if sinful and sensual, they wander about on the astral plane until their death hour comes, cut off in the full flush of earthly passions, which bind them to familiar scenes. They are enticed by the opportunities which mediums afford to gratify them vicariously. There is a lot of mention of mediums here because this was written at the end of the 19th century, when mediumship was very spread, around the world. Theosophical teachings are normally, the view is normally is that mediumship is not good. There are a few situations in which it could actually help the soul. I mentioned that when, for example, people die with something that they need to communicate to their families, and they will just not move on until they can say that. In those cases, if they have the opportunity to say what they needed to say, then that brings some kind of, resolution in their consciousness, and then they can fall asleep and move on. So those are probably among the few situations in which mediumship is okay. In most other cases, it's not. Again, this is very complex because what we are talking, I mentioned that, and I want to bring it up again. One thing is to have the attention of the soul brought back into the physical plane by means of mediumship or even channeling. But there is a different kind of channeling that we could talk about. That is, if a person is sensitive on the higher planes, then that person is communicating to the dead person on those higher planes. It's not bringing the awareness to the physical plane. Instead of we inviting the deceased to again partake of physical life, we go up there and we communicate on the interests that belong to them on those higher planes. So that is a different situation. Now, normally it's very difficult to distinguish between the two unless somebody is clairvoyant and can see. Are you communicating to a person that is on the higher planes, or is this person coming down to the physical, let's say? So, all these things are quite complex. What we can do in these classes is to give the general principles, and now the application in particular cases really needs a complete research, including clairvoyant research, to be able to determine which of all these different, possibilities are. But anyway, in the case of these evil people who die suddenly, they are thrown in the astral plane as the master says, full flash of earthly passions. Something that perhaps I should mention here is why is a sudden death not as less preferable than a normal death? Besides the idea of the astral body being alive, that I mentioned, to make it clear, when we go through old age that our culture tends to hate, it's actually a blessing for the soul, because it is through old age that the soul, little by little, wears out desire, attachments, the fact that our body is not so beautiful, the fact that the body is not so strong, is not so healthy, etc., etc. Our old friends begin to pass. All this is naturally prepares consciousness to little by little, gradually let go of the strong attachment that we normally have in life. When a person dies young, that person suddenly, that person dies with all the desires far more active. So the old age is a natural process that life brings to help us transition more smoothly. So when a person dies of natural causes in old age, then consciousness there on the astral plane has a far easier time letting go, because this process already happened to some extent during life. But in the case of sudden death, that opportunity is not there. And especially in the case of evil people, they died suddenly and in the full strength of their passions. And that is the worst possible situation to find oneself on the astral plane. And the master says they are the pisachas. Pisachas are demons in Hinduism, the incubi and succubi of medieval times, the demons of thirst, gluttony, lust, and avarice, elementaries of intensified craft, wickedness, and cruelty, provoking their victims to horrid crimes and reveling in their commission. So you see that many times when there is a person committing a crime, many times they say, a voice told me to do it, or I was forced to do this, or Satan, or sometimes they will say, God, told me to do this. In the Theosophical view, this is true. Many times these kind of entities stay on the astral plane and they become this kind of tempting demons that seek normally the mentally unstable to push that person to do the same things that they used to do during life. Or these entities in Theosophical literature, they are called elementaries. These, people who are alive on the inner planes and without a physical body, but still alive, and that have these, bad tendencies. And they seek to push people to, as the master says, they are gluttony, lust, or to all these negative emotions, because they are trying to feel vicariously those same emotions, by their connection with these people. Again, normally this happens in people who are either mentally ill, or people who whose consciousness loses hold on the body by drunkenness or by the use of substances, drugs or things like that. That may happen, not that this happens to every one of them, but this may happen, especially when a person's awareness is not fully there for whatever of these reasons, or mental illness. I mentioned that. So they are actually negative forces that push people to do these kind of things. And these are, the masters and the early theosophical teachings, they say that Satan doesn't really exist. But there are these tempting demons, which are not demons that were created separate from human beings. These are human beings on the astral plane. All evil comes from human beings, according to Theosophical view, from the human beings who, take the wrong turn. And then, of course, these are more exceptions than normal cases. And the master says, at last, at the fixed close to their natural period of life, they are carried out of the earth aura, which is the Kamaloka, into regions where for ages they endure intense suffering and end with an entire destruction. So this is probably the only case in which we have the destruction of a personality, not the soul. We will see a little about that. These personalities have removed themselves so much from the divine life, let's say, that their fate is just destruction. And Annie Besant says, it is possible for the lower manas, for the lower mind, the concrete mind, to so entangle itself with kama, with desires and passions, as to wrench itself away from its source, from the soul. This is spoken of in occultism as the loss of the soul. So now you have a person that is not really connected to the soul. You have a mind, a set of desires, and a physical body that are not connected to the soul. This is the case in extremely wicked people, let's say. And when those people die, they are on the astral plane as elementaries. And because there is no connection with the soul, those that emotional and mental body are going to be dissolved. And then the soul has to incarnate with a new personality. It depends on how badly the case was. Sometimes the soul has to actually go back and start over at a certain point in evolution to regain what it was lost. In other cases, it's just the loss of that personality and the soul continues to incarnate, just losing that personality. So Besant says, it is, in other words, the loss of the personal self, you see, the personal self, not the soul, which has separated itself from its parent, the higher ego or soul, and has thus doomed itself to perish. Such a soul, having thus such a personal soul, the personal self, having thus separated itself from the immortal triad during its earth life, becomes an elementary after it has quitted the dense and etheric bodies. Remember at the beginning of the class, we saw there are three aspects to the soul. There is, the animal soul, the personal soul or human soul, the spiritual soul. So that's why in Theosophy, the word soul we tend not to use it. We prefer higher ego is a more definite, this is higher manas. When using soul is vaguer, so you have to interpret in the context what this means. But basically the reincarnating soul, the higher ego, higher manas, is not what is going to be dissolved. It's only the personality, which was always going to be dissolved after death, except for those spiritual aspects of the personality that the soul can absorb. But that dissolution, as we see, normally is peaceful, is natural. It happens when the person is unconscious. In this case, because the whole of the mind was identified with the passions, is the solution with full consciousness, and that produces suffering in that consciousness that separated itself from the soul. So after dying, Besant says, clad in its desired body, this elementary lives for a while, for a longer or shorter time, according to the vigor of its vitality, a wholly evil thing, dangerous and malignant, seeking to renew its fading vitality by any means laid open to it, and by the folly or ignorance of still embodied souls. Its ultimate fate is indeed destruction, but it may work much evil on its way to its self-chosen doom. This is also the source of the idea of vampires and all that. These entities, these elementaries, know that they are on a path of destruction. So they try to absorb vitality, to extend their life as much as possible. And sometimes that kind of life can be extended for a while, but eventually the elementary is doomed to destruction. Now, what is important here is the following. First, Besant says the population of Kamaloka, let's say the awakened, the population of Kamaloka that is awake on the astral plane, is thus recruited with a peculiarly dangerous element by all the acts of violence, legal and illegal, which send the soul out clad in the desired body, throbbing with pulses of hatred, passion, emotion, palpitating with longings for revenge, with unsatiated lusts. A murderer in the body is not a pleasant member of society, but a murderer suddenly expelled from the body is a far more dangerous entity. Society may protect itself against the first, the murderer that is alive, but in its present state of ignorance, it is defenseless as against the second. So this is an unwanted and unknown consequences of the death penalty. When the government kills these people, what they are doing, normally what they think is, okay, this person is out of society, is not a problem any longer. What Annie Besant is saying here is exactly the opposite. Now you have created this kind of demon that will come back in, full of revenge, and this sense, imagine you were killed, full of these negative emotions, and they will try to induce these mass shootings or these crimes or these serial killers, etc. It is very unwise from a theosophical point of view to kill people in any circumstances, but even more to kill these evil people, because then you just lost the possibility of controlling them on the astral plane. So Annie Besant always proposed that the prison system should be a system of education, that there is nobody gains anything by punishing people who do wrong things, because you just keep making people more resentful, and then you have on the astral plane all these angry people, consciousnesses, let's say. So she said, we have the right to separate them from society if they are doing things that are not compatible with society, but then we should do our best to educate them, to try to, in many people you will not be able to change them completely, but any degree, the possibility of reducing to any degree that you can all those evil tendencies will be good for the soul and will be good for society and humanity as a whole. So that's what she always proposed. All right, so It's unfortunately we have to close in this point that is not a very, high point. But this is, as I said, I think it's important to be aware of this. The overall, these are exceptions. The overall idea of the astral plane, the Kamaloka, is this kind of purgatory, as I explained. For most people, this is nature helping us. Most people cannot let go of attachments during daily life, but if the attachments are not too strong, then nature does it for them in Kamaloka. You know, if we can cooperate with nature, if we can do this while we are alive, then the post-mortem life is completely devoid of any difficulties or any sense of sorrow. On the contrary, as we are going to see in our next session, the bulk of the life after death for most people is the heavenly experience, the heavenly state. That is, while Kamaloka may last 80 years, let's say, again, it can be a few hours, it can be even more for people who are attached to it. But let's say 80 years, then in the heavenly states, we can be there, depending on our degree of spirituality, for 800 years or 2,000 years. And that is the bulk of our experience in life after death, before we incarnate again. But this preliminary purgatory stage is necessary, and it's actually nature helping us make that transition. If we help nature, we go through it swiftly. If not, then we will have to do the work that we don't do during our daily life. We will have to do it on the Kamaloka. This is why Socrates said, for example, that the aim of a philosopher is to learn how to die correctly. One interpretation of that is that if we understand what happens after death, then that can help us live in the right way, so that we die in the right way. And all the religions and the emphasis on morality, on spiritual practices, again, they all have the continuation of our life after the death of the physical body in view. They all are talking not only from the point of view of the evolution of the soul, but also from the point of view of what our experiences will be after we leave the body behind.